Welcome to American National Government. In this course, you will discuss the purpose, structure, and evolution of United States government.
I'm Jordan O'Connell, History and Government Instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College. This lecture distills a decade of my written notes taken from American Government, Roots and Reform, American Government by Lenz and Holman, and our course-assigned OpenStax American Government textbook. This lecture focuses on post-Cold War foreign policy and authorized force. The core question is this: how should a republic authorize force abroad when threats move fast, presidents claim emergency discretion, and Congress prefers post hoc approval to visible responsibility? The core competency is to describe the aim of United States foreign policy since the dissolution of the Soviet Union. How should a republic authorize force abroad when threats move fast, presidents claim emergency discretion, and Congress prefers post hoc approval to visible responsibility? The fight moves through authorizations, deployments, alliances, intelligence claims, appropriations, and executive decisions that keep force active after urgency fades. When the Soviet Union dissolved, the United States did not retire from world politics. It lost one organizing enemy, but it kept the military capacity, alliance network, intelligence agencies, trade ambitions, and presidential habits of a global power. That created a strange civic problem. Victory did not produce simplicity, it produced choice. Without one Cold War framework, leaders had to decide when to expand alliances, open markets, impose sanctions, intervene for humanitarian reasons, fight terrorism, deter rival powers, and restrain themselves. The civic problem is that foreign policy tempts citizens into lazy certainty from a safe distance. It is easy to demand intervention before the casualty reports arrive. It is easy to demand restraint before mass killing appears on screens. It is easy to praise trade when prices fall and condemn it when factories close. It is easy to support sanctions without naming who absorbs the pain. Foreign policy is government action under conditions where evidence is partial, geography is distant, and consequences can last longer than the leaders who authorize them. Foreign policy is government strategy for dealing with other countries and global problems. National interest is a government's judgment about what protects security, prosperity, values, or power. Those words sound tidy until they collide. A policy may protect security and damage human rights. It may protect jobs in one sector and raise prices for consumers. It may defend an ally and risk escalation. It may remove a dictator and create a governing vacuum. The 2001 authorization for use of military force serves as the source anchor because one congressional authorization can structure decades of policy. Congress passed it after the September 11th attacks to authorize force against those responsible. Presidents then used it as a legal foundation for counterterrorism operations far beyond the first battlefield the public imagined. That is the post-Cold War foreign policy problem in miniature. Crisis creates authority, authority creates machinery, and machinery keeps operating. During the Cold War, U.S. foreign policy usually organized itself around containment of Soviet power. That did not make decisions simple or wise, but it gave officials a dominant map. After the Soviet collapse in 1991, the United States kept the military capacity, alliance network, carrier groups, intelligence reach, and sanctions tools of a superpower, while losing the one rival that had structured most grand strategy. The problem after victory was not demobilization. It was deciding what justified continued intervention, alliance expansion, and global enforcement. The first test came before the Soviet ashes cooled. Congress passed the 1991 authorization for use of military force against Iraq after Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and President George H.W. Bush led a coalition war under both congressional and United Nations cover. That episode suggested the post-Cold War order might rest on limited coalition enforcement. The rest of the decade made the picture less tidy. Somalia turned humanitarian intervention into urban combat and televised retreat. Rwanda showed the cost of non-intervention. Bosnia and Kosovo pushed the United States and NATO into coercive action against ethnic cleansing, sometimes with international support thinner than the moral language used to justify it. At the same time, Washington widened the institutional map. NATO admitted Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic in 1999, extending a Cold War alliance into post-Soviet Europe. Trade agreements such as NAFTA tied domestic wages, manufacturing, and regional identity more tightly to foreign policy choices. The Iraq Liberation Act of 1998 declared regime change in Baghdad an American objective even before the 2003 invasion. The War Powers Resolution of 1973 still sat in the background demanding consultation and reporting, but presidents continued to argue that commander-in-chief speed could outrun congressional deliberation. The tools remained varied and mutually contaminating. Diplomacy meant treaties, envoys, recognition, summit bargaining, and coalition management. Sanctions meant asset freezes, banking restrictions, export controls, licensing rules, and allied compliance. Alliances meant basing rights, joint exercises, interoperability, and credibility tests. Military force meant airlift, sea lift, targeting intelligence, rules of engagement, occupation planning, and casualty management. After September 11, 2001, terrorism replaced regional uncertainty as the organizing threat, and the constitutional structure of foreign policy tilted even more sharply toward executive initiative under crisis pressure. Authorization also has a budget trail. Deployments require appropriations, contractors, intelligence support, basing agreements, veterans care, and congressional briefings. A vote authorizing force may be short, but the operational state that follows is long. Each year of funding can normalize an intervention even when the original emergency language no longer matches the actual theater. Presidents face pressure to act decisively abroad because the office concentrates visibility. A bombing, invasion, hostage crisis, terror attack, cyber attack, genocide, coup, or alliance crisis creates a demand for presidential response. The National Security Council, Department of Defense, State Department, intelligence agencies, Treasury Department, Homeland Security, and career officials provide options. Each option carries costs that may not be visible at the podium. A limited strike requires targeting intelligence, legal review, allied notification, force protection, public explanation, and a plan for retaliation. Even a small action enters a chain of command and a chain of consequence. Congress faces a different pressure. Members want influence without owning every consequence. Authorizing force can look patriotic in crisis. Restricting force can look weak if danger grows. Cutting funds can end operations but also endanger troops or allies already committed. Oversight can expose failure but also reveal sensitive information. The AUMF problem shows this pattern. Congress gave presidents broad authority after 9/11, then struggled for years to reclaim precision because repealing, replacing, or narrowing authority forces members to take a public position on security risk. The military faces logistical and strategic limits. It can defeat enemy forces, destroy targets, secure territory for a time, train partners, and gather intelligence. It cannot by itself create legitimate local government, heal sectarian conflict, eliminate ideology, or guarantee political order. Military success and political success are not the same product. Citizens who confuse them become easy targets for confident briefings. Diplomats and alliance managers face credibility problems. NATO commitments require allies to believe the United States will act if needed. Adversaries must believe the same. But credibility can become a trap. Leaders may continue a bad policy because withdrawal appears to signal weakness. They may escalate to protect reputation rather than define achievable goals. A serious foreign policy asks what interest is at stake, not only what image the United States projects. Treasury officials and regulators carry sanctions policy. Sanctions require target lists, banking restrictions, export controls, licenses, enforcement actions, coordination with allies, humanitarian exceptions, and compliance systems. Sanctions can look like a clean alternative to war, but they operate through financial pressure that can spill into civilian life. If sanctions are too weak, targets absorb them. If they are broad, ordinary people may suffer. If allies do not cooperate, targets find workarounds. The sanction is not a magic wand. It is an administrative campaign. Trade officials operate another pressure system. Trade agreements set rules for tariffs, market access, intellectual property, labor standards, dispute settlement, agriculture, manufacturing, and services. Consumers may benefit from lower prices. Exporters may gain markets. Workers in exposed industries may lose jobs or bargaining power. Communities built around factories may experience trade as abandonment. Foreign policy therefore enters household life through wages, prices, shelves, and regional identity. Military action also drags a logistics chain behind every presidential sentence. CENTCOM planners have to secure basing rights, aerial refueling, sea lift, munition stocks, maintenance crews, contractor support, intelligence feeds, and medical evacuation capacity before limited action becomes real. The 2001 invasion of Afghanistan depended on carrier aviation, special operations teams, Northern Alliance coordination, Pakistani supply routes, and later a sprawling contracting and aid structure that far outlived the opening campaign. The 2002 Iraq AUMF showed the same institutional layering in advance. Congress debated force, but procurement, troop movement, coalition diplomacy, occupation staffing, and reconstruction budgeting had to follow if the authorization turned into war. Citizens face distance and information limits. They may know a foreign policy slogan, but not the map budget, statutory authority, alliance commitment, civilian cost, or exit condition. That does not excuse disengagement. It means judgment requires discipline. Any serious defensive military action has to name what success means, who authorizes it, how long it may last, who governs afterward, what allies will do, what civilians risk, and what happens if the first plan fails. NATO operations, drone policy, special operations raids, sanctions enforcement, and intelligence sharing agreements then carried foreign policy into channels that rarely looked like formal war but still consumed public authority and public money. The 2001 AUMF entered Congress on September 14, 2001, in a capital still carrying the smoke and fear of 3 days earlier. The crucial language authorized the president to use necessary and appropriate force against nations, organizations, or persons that planned, authorized, committed, or aided the attacks and those who harbored them. Those verbs were the weapon. They created a statute that looked specific in a moment of grief, yet carried enough breadth to fuel years of executive interpretation. That breadth proved consequential because the law did not name a short sunset, a closed battlefield list, or a narrow institutional review clock. It became a legal engine for detention policy, drone campaigns, special operations, partner force support, intelligence cooperation, and theories of associated forces that the immediate post-9/11 public had not clearly imagined. Each additional use could arrive wrapped in a memo, a classified finding, or a new operational theory, while the original authorization still sat in place. The document also exposes congressional incentives under pressure. Members could vote for unity in crisis and later criticize particular wars or raids without shouldering the full burden of repeal or replacement. Presidents could invoke statutory authority while avoiding the political risk of returning for a narrower vote. Courts often hesitated at the edges. The legal text therefore kept operating because every branch had a reason to let it keep operating. This is the tactical lesson inside the source. A crisis authorization written in fear can become routine government if its verbs are broad, its sunset absent, and its oversight weak. The unresolved judgment is whether constitutional government should tolerate that flexibility once the emergency moment has passed, or whether Congress must force a fresh public reckoning before one authorization becomes a permanent foreign policy chassis. Post-Cold War foreign policy works less like a list of events than a stack of tools under pressure. Alliances deter and entangle. Sanctions pressure and spill. Trade enriches and dislocates. Intervention protects and risks occupation. Counterterrorism disrupts threats and expands executive authority. Globalization connects households to foreign policy choices without asking permission first. The serious audit tracks one tool all the way through its mechanism and limit. Sanctions require financial channels, allied enforcement, humanitarian exceptions, and time. Force requires authorization, logistics, civilian risk management, and an exit condition. Trade requires rules, winners, losers, and supply chain dependence. Alliances require commitment, credibility, burden sharing, and escalation discipline. Once those mechanisms are visible, foreign policy stops sounding like presidential posture and starts looking like institutional risk allocation. The constitutional question should stay visible. Presidents command and move. Congress authorizes and funds. Agencies implement. Allies cooperate or resist. Citizens judge from partial information. When any piece fails, foreign policy drifts. The United States may still act, but action without disciplined authorization and measurable goals becomes motion mistaken for strategy. The unresolved judgment is this. After the Cold War, did the United States use unmatched power to build a safer order, or did it build a habit of action without enough limits? A responsible answer must name the tool, the authority, the interest, the cost, and the stopping rule. Without a stopping rule, foreign policy becomes a machine that keeps running because no one wants to be blamed for turning it off. The unresolved question is whether force remains Republican when authorization survives long after the emergency that sold it.
If you're curious how I'm using AI to build these lectures and reshape higher education, visit thelibertytolearn.com. I'll see you in class.